this, but I don't think I have ever been to a social function in Washington of this size where this many people spoke with no one mentioned politics. Interesting. Not a single mention of the larger context, the country. Nobody brought up Jim Comey. There was a little allusion to Russia. And I think actually, when I said this title, which is on here, "The Revolution is Inclusion," and maybe because of what draws us together, our common kind of grounding for many of us in different ability level issues. But I think it's fascinating and really important and indicative of at least the message I want to bring tonight, which is that there is an alternate reality in this country right now. That all of what we see on television and Fox and MSNBC and CNN and the rest is one version of the country. But there's a completely different version of what's going on in the country, and if you listen to the way in which people introduce themselves as mothers, as teachers, as philanthropists, as activists, as people who care about their neighbors, their families, their children, their grandchildren, there's a whole nother version of the country. And from my point of view, at least, and maybe this is getting close to the end already of my point, so you might be happy that this speech will be very short, that if we recognize that there's an America, and I say this in grand terms a little bit, we recognize there's America where the American spirit, its traditional components, civic activism, concern for neighbor, belief in the dignity of the country, deep values, maybe even religiously grounded vision of the future, a sense of justice and peace being not just for us but for others, all those things which we think about historically as the United States are really very much alive. And for many of us, our intersection with them, tonight at least, comes through children, grandchildren, brothers, sisters, friends, parents of children who confronted or who are confronting the world by having to challenge its definition of what's normal and what belongs. So I know you all, many of you mentioned my mom and dad, for which I'm grateful. That camp that started in 1962 across the street from White Flint Mall, in the back of a field where Kathleen volunteered, and I did too. I was much younger than she was. She was a wise teenager, and I was in diapers. Not quite, but sort of. That camp, let's remember some of the fundamentals of what was going on there. First of all, at that farm in Rockville, about a third of the kids were kids of color. 2 years before the March on Washington, or 18 months, I should say, before the March on Washington. Almost all of those kids came from institutions, so they were in effect orphans. So they had been given the label that marked them as so different that not even their families could stand or allow themselves to maintain a connection. They were young children. And they were invited to come and play really somewhat meaningless activities: kickball, horseback riding, dodgeball, and swimming races. While, at least in my mother's case, her brother was the President of the United States about the business of what was really important. But for me, at least, the foundational experience there, the revolutionary idea that Kathleen referred to and that all of you have embodied in your own lives, or at least most of you have in some way or another, is the idea that our fundamental commitment should be, at some level, to broadening the circle of belonging. So one of my favorite stories about the Special Olympics movement that jumps ahead, it's at the beginning of the book for those of you that have had a chance to read it. If you haven't, you only have to read the first chapter to get this, and then you can put it down. But it came in New Haven in 1995 at Yale Bowl. We're up there for the World Games. 80,000 people in the sort of beat-up old Yale Bowl stadium, poor security. The president, then President Bill Clinton, agrees to come. Helicopters in on Marine One, lands on the field next door. The security was not strong enough to allow him to come down on the field and mingle with the athletes. 6,000 people with intellectual differences from 135 countries. So these are the iconic representatives of their nations who were also the scorned and forgotten people in their nations. President's up on the top row. Volunteers everywhere. Pele is there, and Hootie and the Blowfish, and Naughty by Nature, and all kinds of stars and so on. And down in the field, all the athletes, that's 6,000 of them, have cameras. They've been given single-use cameras. Do you remember cameras? Anybody? Yeah. So in the younger group, they have no idea what I'm talking about when I tell this story. But anyway, so they're down there, and one of the professional photographers looks over and sees a group over there, assumes they're from an African nation. They've got colorful African-looking clothing on, and he sees they're all getting pictures of Clinton, who's way up at the top of the stadium. And he takes a closer look, and he realizes all 10 of them have their cameras backwards. And the lens is pointing on their noses. So he realizes they've never used a camera before. They're coming from someplace they have no idea what it is that they're doing. So he goes over, not knowing if they speak English, and says, you're trying to get a picture of the president and the athlete. Well, you have to turn the camera around, and then you go like this, and you push the button. And the athlete turns to him and says, "Oh, thank you." He says, "But if you look through the viewfinder backwards, it works like binoculars, and you can see the president perfectly." So I love that story. The person who told it most proudly was the photographer. And the simplest version of the lesson I've been able to come up with is that we look across at each other and we often get each other wrong. We look through so many lenses that are blurry. Labels, identities, assumptions. The photographer was a good guy. He was a volunteer. Some of you are volunteers now. Linda, my wife and family, we're all volunteers at Special. But if you talk to our kids today, they will start to tell stories when they were 6 and 8 and 10 as volunteers in unified sports and how many mistakes they made about their peers. Even the best intentioned people look through the lens of labels. And if you look at where the country is right now, think about it. How divided and exclusive most of us are, and how much antipathy there is. I mean, unlike any stories I've heard since the Civil War. Today I was talking to, sister who refuses to talk to brother. All across the country. You see families divided, not just political parties divided, states divided, communities divided, religiously oriented, divided what? Mostly over labels. Mostly over assumptions. Mostly over the belief that we're just too different to be able to get along in this country today. And so I think the lessons of the Special Olympics athletes, of Joel, of so many of your sons and daughters and nieces and nephews, are really relevant to the country right now. Because these are, in some ways, human beings who have lived their lives on the other side of a label where many people thought they were too different to belong. And yet, over and over again, if you listen back to your own words, they taught me what it means. They taught me the importance of. They taught me the value of. They taught me they taught me so. Who's they? The person who sees the world so much differently than you do. Who somehow broke through all of your defenses, all of our defenses, to invite you to see yourself and others differently. So if you think about it, how do we see ourselves today in Washington, D.C.? How do we see ourselves today in the United States? If you look at the data, what do we see the other day, the piece in the New York Times, 11 school shootings in the first 22 days of the year. How do we see ourselves? Highest rates of depression and anxiety in college freshmen ever measured, off the charts. Each of the last 4 years, the number has gone higher. Clinical levels of depression and anxiety in our college freshmen. These are not kids in the lower income and urban communities. These are kids who are, for the most part, kids at the top level. Opioids. All the news you see today, you see over and over again, white men, I think it's the leading cause of death now, right? Is suicide, I believe. Overdose. So I think we got to recognize that the way in which we see ourselves, and to some extent the way we see others, reflects what I think of as a crisis in the country that is completely different than any political crisis we faced, well, not than any, than most political challenges we faced in the past. And I would say, since the Civil War, that the country is more divided and more paralyzed and more at risk than at any time probably since the Civil War. Attitudes, people talk a lot about weapons of mass destruction. I think the most dangerous weapon of mass destruction in the world today is attitudes of mass destruction. Attitudes that we're too different to be able to get along. The country is being pulled apart by the perception that our values are too different, our common approaches are too different to matter. So I think we come together as people interested in disability rights, in families, in sports, with a big agenda, not just for our own children and our own families, but for the nation. I think it's that important that we ought to think of ourselves in terms of what we represent, not necessarily for who we elect, because Kathleen's a political leader and figure and been in elected politics. But if you talk to most politicians, the main goal is to take back the House or to protect the House. The main goal is to win. Now, I know that's an oversimplification, but not many people say the main goal is to unite the country. Not many people in political life today are given the freedom, if you will, to cross boundaries and go into the gym on a Saturday morning, Republicans and Democrats and independents, right and left, north and south, east and west, and actually learn to recognize each other, to turn the camera around. So I think the civil society sector in the country has an enormous responsibility right now to do that. And even and most importantly on the divisive issues, and even most importantly people like those of us in the room tonight who have firsthand experience of what it means to have your heart changed, not just your head changed. So I thought I'd suggest, when we look at the country now and when we look at what we need to know, it's almost a little bit the wrong title. In my view, it's kind of what we need to feel. We're at a hearts and minds moment. I don't think we're going to descend into a violent civil war, but I think the country is at risk of fracturing so deeply that we lose our capacity to lead, our capacity to be strong, our capacity to stay together at such a fundamental level that we compromise our future. So you say to yourself, well, it's easy to say if you've got a nice, beautiful child with Down syndrome, or you've got a nice, beautiful child with this or that, but these are much more serious problems, Tim. So I thought I'd give you 3 quick examples of people who inspire me to think that breaking down even the most serious boundaries is possible. Now, I didn't do PowerPoint, you'll be happy to know, but I brought pictures. So the first picture I brought is a picture of Patty Saylor and her son Ethan. Now, this is just old-fashioned printouts. This is the old-fashioned way, So Patty Saylor is a Maryland resident from Frederick, Maryland. And her son Ethan has Down syndrome, and he lost his life at the hands of law enforcement. He was, in a ridiculously tragic sense, lost his life because he refused to leave a movie theater when the second showing of a movie he wanted to watch a second time was coming on. And the law enforcement people thought him to be so difficult and dangerous that they put him into a neck thing and severed his trachea. Now, this is not the only story of unjust law enforcement outcomes in the country. There's a lot of them. But what does Patty Saylor commit her life to? She commits her life to training police officers so that every police officer will enter the police force having met or come to know or understand people like her son Ethan. People with autism, people with sensory challenges, people with Down syndrome, what it's like to try to de-escalate a conflict when they're involved. She was appointed by Governor O'Malley to create the Ethan Saylor Commission. And who was on the commission? All law enforcement, state police, corrections officers, county police officers, SWAT team leaders, disability advocates. There wasn't a single fight on the commission. So in the face of what we think of as hopelessly causing adversarial relationships, this woman goes in the exact opposite direction, and now states around the country are beginning to follow Maryland in adopting new guidelines for all law enforcement training so that they get hours and units not taught about people with intellectual disabilities, but taught by them. So in the state of Maryland, this curricula is now taught by people with intellectual disabilities to every incoming law enforcement officer at the county, corrections, or state level. Yeah, isn't that amazing? Here's Troy Daniels. Troy Daniels is another young man with Down syndrome from the state of Vermont. So Troy was picked in this picture by his high school class to be the valedictorian speaker. Troy, when he started as a first grader, was the first class of kids with disabilities to go to their local school and not be enrolled in a special school. So Troy gives what I consider I consider actually the best graduation speech I've ever heard. I'm just going to read you a few lines from it, just so you get the sense of what it means to confront challenge, and instead of hating and spiting and dividing, crossing the boundaries. Here's Troy's speech. This is the whole thing. I'm just going to read it 2 or 3 paragraphs. My name is Troy Daniels. My friends call me TD. I'm a person with disabilities, he goes on. When I say my friends, I mean real friends. Most of you all think people have friends, but for people with disabilities, friends are not always real. Not long ago, people with disabilities could not go to school with other kids. They had to go to special schools. They called people like me retard. That breaks my heart. I came to school, the law says all kids had to go to school together. We were little kids together. Some kids started to think I was okay. First it was just 1 or 2. I told them I want to have real friends. We started to learn that in some ways we were different, but in other ways we were the same. Think Republicans and Democrats. Think Trump voters and Hillary voters. It's impossible, right? Some ways we're different, and in some ways we're the same. How many politicians are running today on platforms that say, in some ways we're different, but in some ways we're the same? My goal is not to win a policy fight, but to unite the country. So this is how Troy ends. I want all people to know and to see that these students I call my friends are the real teachers of life. They are showing you how it should be. Yes, I am a person with a disability. The law says I'm included. But it is my friends who say, TD, come sit by me. Now, this 18-year-old with Down syndrome, to me, has learned something quite profound about all of us. And especially those of us who live in a city like this. That we can count on the law, and we can count on coercion and restrictions and rules to change the way the world is, and we should. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to say the law doesn't matter, and I'm not here to say that there aren't real serious fights for social justice. But beyond the law, this country was always held together by the sense that there is something bigger than the law that holds us together. Think of the great rhetoric of the civil rights movement. Yes, it was powerful. Yes, it was strident. Yes, it was angry. Yes, it was insistent. but it was also deeply religious. It was also grounded in values, and it was also calling all Americans to their own best ideals. This is what Troy does. Does the exact same thing. He says, yes, the law gave me the chance, and yes, the law was important to allowing me to be here, but there's something bigger than the law. It's human beings who reach across the aisle and say, when I'm sitting alone, come sit by me. So, I love Troy. My last example. This is a picture of a woman named Scarlett Lewis. I have copies of these. I don't know why I made 3 copies and see if it would work. So there's Scarlett Lewis. I'm going to pass Scarlett that way. You can just take a look at her. And her son, Jesse. Jesse is 6 years old in this picture with his mom. Jesse Lewis was shot 4 times at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. And Scarlett decided, wrote a beautiful book. If you have a lot of tissue and are willing to embark on a journey to understand what it means to heal from something that horrific, read her book. It's called Nurturing Healing Love. So what is Scarlett doing now? Whatever it is, 10 years after Sandy Hook? Not quite that long. 5 years after Sandy Hook. She had started a social and emotional learning curriculum. The curriculum's called Choosing Love. And her goal is to dedicate the rest of her life to Adam Lanza. Because her belief is that if someone had shown Adam Lanza love, that this never would have happened. Because he was just like her little boy, but never found a place. And so she goes from school to school and classroom to classroom and puts her curriculum up on the internet and has other people working with her on assessments and so on. And the whole message of the curriculum is that you in first grade or in third grade or sixth grade, you have a choice. And you should choose love. Scarlett and many other people in the Sandy Hook community left the whole idea of political fighting over guns to the side. Saw that there was no, from her point of view, no hope to restore the goodness of her son's life or the hope of other children through that battle. Why? Because the political system had become so broken that there was no hope of a coalition of people who could commit themselves to making schools better for children. So she decided to do it on her own, completely outside, but has gathered thousands of parents and schools in Connecticut and around the country to her movement. So I'm going to stop there and just close by saying that what I've been blessed with in my life is not just great parents, great cousins, an extraordinary wife who, together with me, had had the chance to watch 5 extraordinary children grow up. Almost every blessing possible. And what we found in common over and over again is that we find our best selves when we're bridging gaps, honestly. I mean, just last Christmas, this will sound like I'm bragging, but I want to brag on Linda a little bit, organized our Christmas vacation to go down to Puerto Rico and volunteer with Save the Children. Not because we're trying, it's not like any big thing, it was just the most fun we could possibly have. And I'm telling you, I don't care where you went for Christmas, you did not have as much fun as we did in Puerto Rico. I promise you. I don't care where you went. You went south of France, you went to Tahiti, I don't care. We had more fun. So we've had the, extraordinary blessings, honestly. But the most powerful blessings have come from our training, if you will, in being able to see each other across boundaries and heal where there are divisions. And for me, what I feel that the Troy Danielses of the world and the Ethan Saylors and the Scarlett Lewises are saying to all of us is that there's a moment now of urgency in the country. And the future is kind of hanging in the balance. And it's not certain where it's going to end. We don't know whether this country is going to really opt for a future that brings us back together or not. And I think the voices of my parents and of all those millions of Special Olympics athletes and coaches and volunteers and partners who are out there every day lining fields and pumping up basketballs and opening up swimming pools and rural India, driving their kids over to the special school, and in central China doing the same thing, and young leaders in the Philippines and Singapore and in Uganda and Malawi who are organizing teach-ins so kids can learn about difference. They're all kind of saying, come on, you guys. You're the greatest country in the world. Founded on the greatest principles ever, the most important of which was that you were the place where those who didn't belong could find a way. Can't you do it again? And I don't have the answer to how we do it again. I'm not in politics and have no plans to enter it, and that's a good thing. But I do think that those of us not in the political life, especially in a city like this, when we get the privilege of gathering with Chris bringing us together with delicious food and great company, should remind ourselves that we have to kind of lock our arms together at some level right now in this country and try to recognize that the most important thing we can do is bring unity to an otherwise divided world. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm sure you wouldn't mind if we engage in a few questions. If people would like to ask questions or make a comment.
I'm also happy to just tell stories about my parents. So many of you know them. We just go back and have No, just kidding.
Your father, I can tell a story about your father.
I bet you can.
We weren't open too long, and he was involved with the Baltimore Orioles, was he?
He was, for a little bit, yep.
And he came in here and he was all upset because he found out that he had to go to an event up there and he didn't have a tie.
At the stadium?
Yes, at the stadium. He had to go and he was very concerned. So my former husband, who was here at the time, lent him his tie.
Did he ever return it? Don't answer that. Yeah. That's fun.
Well, thank you. Oh, yes, please.
Just curious, I mean, how do you bring about change? That's really, you said you had no solutions to that. Some of us do different things.
Yeah.
I founded now head of an organization, a non-governmental organization whose mantra is to promote bipartisanship in foreign policy.
Yeah.
We have a board of advisors, half Democrat, half Republican. We only do things on a bipartisan basis.
Right.
We have the single best congressional staff program in the country. So we do things organization like that. We try to help create a different culture of and giving decision makers space. That there's some support out there on both sides of the aisle. But we also do things individually. And I, for example, I spend just one day a week feeding the homeless in the hungry. So you can do things on an institutional basis, an organizational basis. You can do things on an individual basis. And I've always thought that there's some literature out there that others can comment on this more than I can. There's some literature out there about the neurological literature, the clinical literature about the salutary, the health benefits of altruism.
Right.
I mean, there's really some kind of interesting research on that. So if you're self-interested, you want to get healthy, go out and do something that's purpose for somebody else.
I think that's absolutely the case. You know, I won't, Kathleen, I'll just pick on you at some point and just make you stand up and say something. But you know, Kathleen did work very hard when she was in state government to promote the idea that service should be the common experience of all kids, and so the whole idea of service hours and service commitments as a graduation requirement almost, not just in Maryland but in many states, originated with and was driven by, against great opposition by Kathleen, in part because obviously the social benefits but also the personal benefits of engagement. So if you think about like your bipartisan foreign policy agenda, why don't we have in this day and age the expectation of national service for every young person? I mean, you could say it's a hopeless political thing, but honestly speaking, what is stopping this country from saying that at 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, every young person ought, as a rite of passage, to provide 6 months or a year of his or her life in service to the country? I mean, that sounds so old-fashioned, that's so quaint in today's language, and yet it is absolutely, in my view, unbelievable that we haven't been able to move the country in a direction like that. I mean, imagine both, either party, you don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat to believe in national service. I mean, John McCain, the last election, John McCain, John Kerry, these are all men, for the most part, men who have given, and of course Mrs. Clinton had a huge amount of her life was in public service. But why don't we elevate that to a political platform that both parties could endorse and actually put some muscle behind? I don't know the answer, but I really want to applaud you for the bipartisan foreign policy thing, because if we had the same kind of group on the environment, if we had the same kind of group on the minimum wage, if we had the same kind of group on energy, if we had the same kind of group on education, when I did my work in schools, we would be able to do so many good things that might not please the fringes in the parties, but would make a huge difference for the country, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
So, you told us a story once about the spoken word and the word movement, and there was a song with a catchy riff that said, "Let's get it started again," and then had a really obnoxious line.
Right.
And rather than shaming or publicly humiliating the people behind that song, you took the lead singer out to lunch.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, Dean's referring to actually our son, Linda's and our son Tim, and a friend of his store in Palumbo, 10 years ago this year, launched a campaign at a youth rally in Boise, Idaho, to sensitize kids to the hurtful use of the word retard as a playground taunt. Don't be so retarded, you dropped the ball, you retard, my mother's, telling me I'm a retard, that kind of common usage. So they launched this thing called Spread the Word, Let's End the Word. And the truth is, they did it in part in response to a guy, when Dick Morris, if you remember Dick Morris, was on the O'Reilly show during this youth summit, and I think he called, I can't remember, but he called somebody a retard on the O'Reilly show. And the kids were watching the show. And all these kids with and without disabilities were watching the show, and they wrote a letter to him. There was a 5-day-long conference. They wrote a letter on Monday, and O'Reilly did an apology on Friday. So they were super empowered. They got a little help from a few people to get it to O'Reilly and all that kind of stuff. But that's not the point. The point is they were empowered, so they launched this campaign, challenged kids all over the country. Well, what happens immediately is you find hundreds and hundreds of very prominent people who use it all the time. So they began this process of identifying people and saying, not I want to catch you or punish you, just I want to ask you to not do that any longer. And here's why. So the song, the Black Eyed Peas has a song called Let's Get Retarded in Here. And it was a huge hit. It still is a big hit. Only the lyric now is Let's Get It Started in Here. So Will.i.am was the lead singer, wrote the song. And he was a little, he says, you got it wrong. Retardato is a musical term. I was using it to connote the let's slow it down in here kind of mentality. I said, there's a lot of reasons why people use the language, but the language carries pain. So, I mean, again, it's a good example of where, without confrontation or antagonism, just with invitation, it's an overused term now, but teachability, take the teachable moment, and they change the lyric, and that's a big thing for an artist to do. I mean, it's one thing for a politician or a media person, but for an artist to change the lyric of their song, for most artists, it's too much of a concession. They don't want to admit that they're being pressured by public or cultural or political, especially political correctness. But we won him over. He's a convert, and he's a friend, and he's an ally. And that's really what, I just think that can happen more often if we created contexts and cultures that allowed people to bridge gaps rather than punish them for being on the other side of one. Kathleen, what should we be doing?
it's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. Thank you for mentioning the community service. I have to say about community service, just to give you what a challenge it was in Maryland. Thank you for mentioning it. So when I tried to get Maryland, scream.
Yeah.
Thank you. So when I did try to get, thank you for mentioning that, Cindy. So when I did try to get Maryland to be the first state in the country to require community service as a condition of high school graduation, it was opposed by 22 of the 24 boards of education, the PTA, and the teachers union. So it was a very big fight, and in fact, Maryland is still the only state that requires it. There are other cities that do, most private schools do. And the opposition to it came, I mean, I had the reasons people were opposed to it, from the ceiling to the floor, some of it which was from people who do community service in their schools, and they wanted to be special. So they didn't want everybody to do it, but they would be special. It ranged from that kind of, we're cool because we do it and other people don't. I think the challenge, I'm a little more optimistic about our country than Timmy, just because I'm a believer in Arthur Schlesinger swings, that you can swing one way and swing the other. So I think that that's one issue. But I totally agree that it's very difficult for people from different parties to talk to one another. And I have old friends who are Republicans. But it's very tough. Actually, when I ran for lieutenant governor, a guy called Robert Emmett Terrell, sent me some money. He runs the American Spectator. And my campaign was furious when I got money from this guy. And all his friends were furious that he gave me money. So he pissed everybody else off. And you're not laughing, I can tell. And so it really is a challenge for everybody here to walk across the aisle and talk to somebody who politically disagrees with you and figure out how you can talk to them. Because it's cool to be righteous in your own tribe. And so I think the great thing is to try to reach across religious or political differences. I think I totally agree with Cindy.
Yeah, I think. Look, I hope I didn't come across as pessimistic. I just think the question is a live question. I think sometimes people think, oh, sooner or later this is all going to go away and everything will swing back. I hope it does, but I think it's up to individual actors to make sure that happens. So I think there's, like I started out, I think there's two Americas. I think in a room like this, you see the best of the United States, and there's lots of rooms like this. They're not just rich or white or Washington or urban-based. They're poor, they're people of color, they're people in rural communities. There are a lot of people in rooms like this that if they went around the room, they would describe the exact kinds of experiences you guys have described, and they're doing things about them in their own communities, and they're open-minded, and they're tolerant, and they're welcoming, and especially their kids are super open to making a better future. So I think there's the work is there to be done, but I do think this political fissure, I think we got to decide whether, I'm guessing more than half of this room is Democratic, although it makes no difference. But because most Washington Republicans would say that what I'm about to say, which is the main goal right now is to win back the House and get rid of this current kind of a regime. And whatever it takes, if you say in a cocktail party, I think we've got to find the good side of Trump voters. Try it. I'd do it.
I do that too.
And it's not.
You're not popular.
You're not popular.
But I totally agree with you.
You're not popular. That's 40% of the voting country. Most people on the Democratic side will say are beyond hope. Now that's untenable. That's a war. It's one thing to say it's 40% of the country I don't agree with on protecting the watersheds or whatever it is that you may have differences of opinion on. But it's another thing to say they're beyond hope. And that, I think, has to change. And the reason I draw that political lesson for tonight is because I don't think any of the institutions that we listen to have an incentive to make a change. MSNBC and CNN and Fox don't have an incentive. They are incentivized to keep us fighting. And unfortunately, the way the congressional maps are drawn and the way money flows into politics, those forces also have an incentive to keep us divided. So when the rules are like that, something else has to happen. Some independent party, some independent-minded spirit, some independent PACs, some bridge-building entities like the ones you've described, at however low the level is. You said, I learned from Shriver that you could do something in your backyard and you could change the world with it, right? I mean, what she did, I'll close with a story about my mother. When she was 2 or 3 years before she died, I said to her, Mama, you should really write a book. She hardly ever even read a book, but much less write a book. But I said, you should really write a book. And she was maybe 82 at the time. And she said, oh, I would never write a book. So boring, so boring. I said, no, actually, you've had an interesting life. I said, I gave her, this, that, and the other thing, the war, woman, big family, politics, all this kind of stuff. And she said, oh, I would have nothing to say. She said, all I ever did was try to teach children with intellectual disabilities to swim.
You know something? The change that you may be looking for was your mom and many women who may get into politics who may be that third party.
You may be right.
That's one of the things that may
You may very well be right. So, but anyway, my point was just that small it can be big. So don't think because you're coaching on Sunday that, well, I'm not doing anything in the big put, or I'm raising money for my organization, or I'm just helping out at the soup kitchen. Something that is small that's going on in each of our lives, when brought together, could be a catalyst for a much bigger conversation that could make a big difference. And if you finished your dessert and you've paid for your wine, you're now free to go.